The view from Tahrir Square vis-a-vis the US reaction, the government's reaction to the revolution in Egypt, was that it was somewhat schizophrenic, that it was at first pro-Mubarak, with Joe Biden saying that Mubarak is a good man and a friend of the United States, and then there was silence, and then there was, we're with the youth. Once there was the feeling that the mass movement, the threshold was being met. And I attribute this, not the perception, but the fact of the matter, to the fact that our US foreign policy towards the Middle East tends to be limited on three tracks: resources, Islamists, and Israel. If you're a government or a leader that helps facilitate the providing of resources to the United States, oil, gas, whatever, then you're a potential ally. If you curb the threat of the Islamists, you're a potential ally. And if you're on the right side of the Israeli-Arab equation, you're a potential US ally. It wouldn't matter what your position is on human rights or your record on civil rights or anything else, or how corrupt or non-corrupt you are. And I think that is precisely the reason why there remains mistrust in the Arab street towards the US position on the future of democracy in that part of the world. Our next speaker is Dr. Qamar-ul, who's a senior program officer in the Religion and Peacemaking program and a scholar of Islam at the US Institute of Peace. He is an expert in many areas. Prime amongst them is the language of violence, conflict resolution, and nonviolence in contemporary Islam. He's author of several books, among them The Crescent and Dove, Peace and Conflict Resolution in Islam, and Striving for a Divine Union, Spiritual Exercises for Sohrawardi Sufis. He taught Islamic studies and comparative religion at Boston College, College of the Holy Cross, and Brandeis University, and he earned his doctorate from UCLA in Islamic intellectual history, and his BA was from Colgate University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Qamar-ul.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. Just making space for my notes here. What I'd like to do in my time, in my discussion, is to really have a few questions posed and attempt to answer these questions, but really it's a work in progress. And as much as we want to really study the phenomena of civil unrest and resistance in Middle East, North African countries, I think we're just still uncovering the profound impact has had in the region, but globally. Not only are we trying to unpack that those particular events, but the big question, I think, tied to this conference and tied to the American Muslim community is, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for our community? How do we digest it? What does it really mean for us politically, socially, economically? And as American Muslims mobilize in the future, how does those events overseas, can they be utilized here, or if there's any space for that? Ahmed had a very beautiful opening, laying down the foundation of this, and I just want to reiterate some of those items before I get into discussing some of the civil resistance. And he spoke eloquently about, and this is all in scholarship and by think tankers and policymakers, and the Middle East and North Africa region was thought to be, and still by many, the center for class of civilizations, the center for authoritarian regimes, an example for exclusiveness. And all of this exclusiveness, there's no room or space for opening of the minds, meaning intellectually, culturally, and of course within philosophy, political philosophy, and so forth. That all of these were enshrined in much of the different spectrums, whether it be liberals, conservatives, or on the other spectrum. The Middle East was written off. Islam and culture, the combine of those forces, were indicators that they upheld and legitimized authoritarian regimes. And in fact, it's the religion of Islam that was the obstacle. These are not mysteries. This is not something I'm making this up. This is really a particular perspective. The last 11 months have shown and demonstrated and undone those particular hypotheses. And while the history is still being written, I think we are still trying to understand not only the root causes and how this happened, but what it really means and so forth. And for the next 5 minutes, I really like to talk about the logic and the strategy of nonviolent resistance that has occurred, and generally not just only in the Middle East, but also in its global effect. Nonviolent resistance is a civilian-based method. It is used to wage nonviolent conflict, socially, psychologically, economically, politically, without the threat or with the use of violence. It includes acts of omission, acts of commission, or a combination of both. Scholars, practitioners, public policy experts have all identified hundreds of nonviolent methods, and they include symbolic protest, economic boycotts, labor strikes, political and social and non-cooperation, nonviolent intervention, the use of media for education, etc. All of these are used to oppose or support different policies to delegitimize the state, to remove or restrict adversaries' sources of power. Nonviolent struggles take place outside of traditional political channels and making it really distinct from other nonviolent political processes such as lobbying or electioning and legislating. So one have said that this nonviolent civil unrest is outside of the political process, while others work within the political process. What we saw in the Middle East and North Africa is the both. Strategic nonviolent resistance is also tied or different from principled nonviolence, and it's grounded in religious or ethically based concepts. Many people are committed to principled nonviolence and engage in nonviolence, and the textbook cases are Gandhi or Martin Luther King's legacies. What we saw in the Middle East and North Africa, we see a conflation of nonviolent struggle with principled nonviolence, pacifism, and also consistent and continued struggle to isolate particular key institutions. At one time, we noticed that in discussions that in the middle, again, with the assumptions were in the Middle East, people thought nonviolent struggle, oh, that's for the passive, that's trying to roll over, that's not part of the Islamic tradition. But we found out, and it's uncovered in the past 10 to 11 months, that nonviolence and pacifism, it combined with strategic nonviolence resistance, was a powerful way to oppose state apparatus. We found in the scholarship and in other places and studies that nonviolent resistance have strategic advantages over violent resistances. And some are going to argue, well, how can you say that? Libya is on the verge of being victorious and so forth. Well, that still needs to be seen. But first, the literature and the scholarship says repressing nonviolent campaigns do backfire. And we've seen this, and we are seeing this in Syria and other places. In backfire, we see that violent repressions adds to more breakdown of obedience amongst regime supporters. So there's greater mobilization of the population, there's internal schisms by the judiciary, the military, and the civil bureaucracy, civil servants. All to just say that when the state breaks or backfires against nonviolent resistors, the state is taking a big risk for losing its own different institutions and their support. And once loyalty shifts, we can see, or even shift to the resistors, we can see that the dynamics are most likely to occur and resistance may have more of fuel to move forward. Internally, members of a regime like civil servants, security forces, and members of the judiciary are more likely to shift towards nonviolent groups and towards opposition groups. And so this is the risk they take. Divisions are more likely to result amongst regime supporters who are not prepared to deal with mass civil resistance. We also see that international community complicates the very act of nonviolence resistance domestically. International community most likely will denounce, create sanctions, repressing nonviolent campaigns or the state oppressions. We see the use and the exploitation of NGOs, non-government organizations, who are most likely part of the nonviolence movement. And we see the issues of causing schisms. NGOs tend to sympathize with the cause. Nonviolent campaigns are being done by NGOs. But the external cost of repressing nonviolent campaigns can be high, especially when the repression is captured by the media. External actors may organize sanctions against repressive regimes that repeatedly crack down on unarmed protesters. Based on a very important study or database, this database is called NAVCO, the Nonviolence Conflict Outcomes Data, where it documents over 325 resistant campaigns from 1900 to 2006. There's some conclusions from that study, and I think some of it may help us flush out what are some of the implications for what's happening in the Middle East and North Africa. First, some of the conclusions is, first, resistance campaigns compel loyalty shifts. It may take time, it may bring it may need international support, but there are loyalty shifts that need to be done amongst the security forces and civilian bureaucracies. Second, the report says loyalty shifts are not only within the securities, but also apparatus, but opponents of elite opponents. Third, we see that nonviolent and violent campaigns are achieved and widespread and when they are decentralized and they're mobilized. One of the critiques of the Middle East uprisings is that where's leadership? Who should we talk to? Who is the Gandhi? Where's the Martin Luther King? And it's very uncomfortable for people in the international community not to speak to one team. But in this data and this report, it says it's very common to have a decentralized leadership based on 325 studies. More research is being uncovered, but they also saw the political cost of repressing 1 or 2 dozen or 3 dozen activists, easily labeled as extremists, Al-Qaeda, or terrorists, really creates and adds to the fuel of hundreds of thousands of activists who represent the entire population, and of course creates other issues. Fourth, campaigns that fail to produce loyalty shifts are then viewed as a success for the state, whereas they can contain the bureaucracy and the military. Mass mobilization, where participation is broad and the campaign is not dependent on a single leader, is then tied into non-violent campaigns. They use Burma and East Timor, but I think what they're really discovering is in the Middle East cases that you find that there's a great deal of influence of religion as opposed to some of the other studies, great deal of interest of other cultural indicators that added to the uprisings. Let me move quickly to some of the questions I want to bring to this conference, and I know I only have a few minutes left, which is, what did American Muslims, how have they understood and internalized? Particularly Egyptian Americans, Tunisian Americans, Libyans, and Yemenis Americans. Even in the second and third generation, we saw a great deal of different expressions. We saw, of course, public outcry, expressions of defiance. We saw a great deal of contacting local and national leadership, but we also saw the second and third generations returning back to their home countries for adding and contributing to the civil unrest. We also saw that there was a great deal of coordination, at least with the Libyan case, of Libyan Americans returning to actively fight in the civil unrest and then turning into a civil war. the question I'm trying to understand is, what is the impact? We've seen American Muslims participate in the civil rights movement, in the anti-war movement in Vietnam, in the anti-war movement in the first Persian Gulf War, and subsequently in the Iraq War. We know American Muslims have participated in a great number of civil rights and civil resistance movements. But what impact is it having in our community? Conferences after conferences by major national groups speak about our religion of Islam, speak about its purity, speak about its different beautiful components, but there's very little integration of the civil unrest principles of nonviolence within Islam, and maybe how we can use that in tackling Islamophobia and using principles of Islamic nonviolence and in tackling CIA, FBI surveillance of our mosques. Maybe there's room, and I'm questioning, maybe there's room to learn from what's happening in the Middle East and North Africa and how we can use that in coalescing and bringing greater mobilization when things are clearly clear and straightforward Islamophobia, either by national leaders or presidential candidates. Perhaps the American Muslim community could first self-educate what has happened over there, but how it's impacting those communities and how it's impacting our communities, and what can we first do to use it to our advantage into mobilizing our community to bring a greater sense of fairness by those in the leadership positions, whether it be Washington or locally. So these, again, just questions. There's clearly no data yet of how the American Muslims are using civil unrest, but it would be very interesting to discover if national groups and local groups think about coordinating it in their conferences and having a more succinct and structural workshops for these practices. Thank you.